We have 4 boards here today, for those that aren't familiar with our structure. And we have, it looks like 2 boards with quorum. And we have 2 boards out of quorum, but I'm expecting Mike Wells, and that'll create quorum for your board as well. So why don't we do this? 10-2, you want to call it meeting to order?
Everybody
Unfair.
call the Peninsula 2 District format meeting to order.
Thank you. And Sandy?
Hereby call Sandy District to order.
Thank you. And when Mike Wells arrives, we'll call MCPD to order as well. We have a small enough group, and we've got a lot of work to do over the next couple of years. I thought it'd be helpful if we did a quick round of introductions. It may take a minute, but we're going to get to know each other pretty well over the next couple of years and rely a lot on each other, so I think it's worth the time to do that. Then we're going to talk a little bit about why you have water bottles in front of you, why there are cameras in the room, and a little bit about the agenda today. And I expected a fun comment from Dick, too. So why don't we,
Would you call your first witness?
as our newest board member, you want to introduce yourself and also explain what you do when you're not here?
Sure. Nathan Phelan. I'm representing Graphic Packaging in Pen 1. I'm taking over for Dave Ernst, who I'm sure most of you know very well. Dave is retiring at the end of the month after 21 years of service. So when I'm not here, I serve as the Environmental Health and Safety Manager for our manufacturing facility.
I'm Vic Stiebold, Vice President with Jupitz Corporation in Pen 2, and been on the Pen 2 board for a while, several years.
Walter Valetta, I'm a real estate broker. I sell floating homes and mortgages when I'm not here. And I think I'm the first person put on the board after the aftermath of the, well, no, I don't know if that's really true, but it's what about after the aftermath of the Bridgeton tree situation, which we got a little coverage in the report, so.
And I'm Karen Myers, Pen 2. We're retired, so we just play and travel as much as possible. I love the drainage district. I really like this area, so here I am.
I'm Dick Schaefer, Pen 2. I live in the district. I also am an industrial real estate broker when I'm not here.
Tim Warren, I'm the president of the Multnomah County Drainage District. I'm also a commercial real estate developer when I'm not here.
George Ringelbach, Multnomah Drainage District. I manage my own properties.
And I'm Phil Ralston. I represent the Port of Portland on the Sandy Board, and I'm the General Manager for Environmental Affairs at the Port.
Dale Champ, I'm on the Sandy Board also, work for NACO Material Handling. Out on the east side of 223rd. I'm the Environmental Safety and Health Officer there.
Great. Steve?
Steve Greenwood from Oregon Solutions. Rick Mulder from the Hatfield School of Government, Center for Public Service.
Phil Kiesling, also from the Hatfield School of Government, Center for Public Service.
May I point out, too, your former Secretary of State?
You can blame me for both of them. I apologize.
Hi, I'm Ashley James. I work at Metropolitan Group and we're helping with some communication support.
Sir?
I'm Ron Dell. I'm with PSU grad student there.
Thank you. I got you an invite, Brandy.
You skipped me. I thought you were I'm Brandy. I'm the office specialist here. Been here for about 9 months.
I'm Josh McNamee. I'm the operations manager here at the district.
Angela Carter. I'm the executive office intern.
I'm Kelly Sherbo. I'm here as a fellow from PSU. I just finished my first year of my PhD program there.
And I have to point out, she's also a graduate of the UVA Law Program. Go Ducks. Yeah, all right.
Byron Walterstorff, I'm the district engineer for Multnomah County Drainage District.
I'm Kayla Mullis, and I'm a project manager working primarily on Peninsula 1 and 2 levy accreditation.
All right, so primary reason why we're recording this is there are a lot of board members that couldn't make it. It's July in Oregon, and that happens. So we want to make sure that they had access to this information after the meeting, because I think you'll find these assessments that we get from PSU and Oregon Solutions very helpful. Secondly, we have a commitment to more transparency in our organization. You'll see later on that we have updated our website, and we're going to launch the website next week. Is that fair to say? Next week, with your permission. But I want you to see that, and you're going to also see that there's going to be easier public access to information, and we can also put clips from today's presentation online so that our partners in the community can understand what it is that we're going through. We can direct people to those pages. You'll also notice that you have water bottles in front of you. We've been using plastic water bottles in the field for many years, and as part of our commitment to environmental stewardship, we have moved to these reusable bottles in the field and in the office, and we ordered enough for board members to have some.
Well, I'm just glad to hear that that's an environmental focus, because I was afraid this was a self-help issue for potential flooding in the future, and I think the group is going to make up the difference we need.
That's right. That's right. As part of your board membership, you know during a flood you have to bring sandbags and your water bottle. So we are not going to be able to talk through everything today. We've got a lot going on. You're going to learn a lot from these assessments. So I want everybody to keep in mind that this is the first conversation. There will be many more, and I think as Steve and Rick put it, this is really the framing of the conversation that we're going to be having. So certainly feel free to ask questions, but also know we're not going to be able to get to all the questions today. That's also the same for some policy issues that Kayla's going to go through towards the end of the meeting that are related to accreditation. So we also are going to change the agenda a little bit. I believe instead of Steve speaking, then Rick speaking, then Steve speaking, Rick's going to go ahead and present first, and then Steve's going to go ahead and present. With that, are there any other questions? Any questions about the agenda? I'll also point out there are, like I said, there will be a few folks coming in a little late. Mike Wells is just walking in now. There are a couple people that need to leave a little bit early, so we won't break. But just so you know that people may come and go. And there's Mike. I just finished introductions. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Mike Wells on the Multnomah County District Board. I work for CBRE, Commercial Real Estate Company. Glad to be here.
And with that, we have a quorum for MCDD. You want to call the meeting to order?
I'll call the meeting for the MCDD board to order.
All right. And with the board members' permission, at some point this year, at a format meeting, I'd like to do a quiz show on Robert Rules of Order to make it a little fun and to learn a little bit more about responsibilities and working through meetings. But I'd also like to surprise you with it, because if I schedule it, you may not show up.
I object.
Yeah.
All right. Any questions? Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Rick?
I got this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach where that no signal is up there. But meanwhile, let me, first of all, he mentioned Robert's Rules of Orders. A little piece of trivia that you may not know is Major Roberts, who wrote Robert's Rules of Orders, was the deputy district engineer of the Portland District Corps of Engineers below these many years ago before he wrote that. So there's a little bit of historical tie in there if people want to follow that up. My name's Rick Mogren. A little bit about myself. I got out here to the Northwest in 1997. I was an engineer officer in the U.S. Army and assigned as the Deputy Commander and Chief of Staff of the Northwest Division of the Corps of Engineers. So all this stuff was sort of under the division's purview there. Served in that capacity for 4 years. Retired from that job in 2001. My family and I settled out here and did a little bit of time as a regional manager for an engineering firm, and then got into consulting and facilitation and program coordination for some of the multi-jurisdictional groups that are out here, like the Columbia Basin Federal Caucus, Been working with NOAA Fisheries on salmon recovery in the Columbia Basin, and have been involved a little bit in the Columbia River Treaty Review process. Finished my PhD and then got hired on part-time by the Center for Public Service, where I teach a couple of courses, graduate courses, and do projects like this that come into the CPS purview. I do want to introduce Kelly and point out that she is my associate in this report, and very much as much a contributor to this as anybody else was, and I want to just thank her for her hard work and support in pulling that together. Okay, now, by way of introduction for the report itself, I'm going to talk about some key points in the report. We're not going to go through the whole thing because there simply isn't time to do that. What I do want to do is hit the high points of the more relevant issues that I think we bring out. I also want to introduce you to our methodology on this. This represents 15 interviews that we conducted with members of the Corps of Engineers, members of FEMA, several folks sitting around the table here, along with other stakeholders here in the basin. Initially, we started out to do an assessment and present the results of those assessments. One of our findings was that not everybody has the same understanding of the different issues out here as everybody else. So everybody knows, the stuff that's right in front of them and the stuff they're dealing with, but there's a very asymmetrical understanding of the facts and circumstances about some of the programs we're going to talk about. So in addition to putting in the results of our interviews in here, we also did some background looking and put in some factual information from the Corps of Engineers, their documents, from the Federal Emergency Management Agency and their documents, and some of the funding and stormwater issues, with the intent as to support what Reed said is the beginning of a conversation. If this collaborative process is going to work moving forward, everybody's got to be operating from the same basis of the facts and knowledge and so on. So the intent is to try to give a baseline of understanding there. It is not all-inclusive, and it's not an authoritative document that way. Like I say, it's intended to provide that fundamental baseline of information. Clearly, as we get into this in more detail, we'll want to have Corps of Engineers folks and FEMA folks in here that can explain in better detail the technical requirements of their various programs. So with that by way of introduction, here's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to pretty much go through the organization so you get an idea of the general content of the report, talk a little bit about what it is we set out to do and what are the consequences of not carrying out some of the things we're talking about here. Zip through some of our key findings, not all the findings, but the key findings, and then talk a little bit about next steps that you all might want to take on. I'm going to be followed by Steve, so I'm going to provide an overview of what we were asked to do is these cross-cutting issues that are facing the 4 districts. Steve's going to bore into more detail on the Penn 1, Penn 2 levy accreditation issue when he gets up. So he'll be going into those details, and I'm going to kind of set the tone and context and all that kind of good stuff for that. This is basically the table of contents for the report itself. I'm not going to belabor this other than to say that within our findings here, there were 3 events that we identified or were identified by our interview respondents that really put the operation of MCDD on the map in the eyes of the residents of the districts. And we're going to talk about what those are. In addition, those 3 events are playing out in the context of some broader trends and issues that are facing not just MCDD, but the metro area in general. Talk a little bit about funding, and then spend some time on our governance options that we were asked to address. Then, like I said, we'll spend some time on the next steps as well. Okay, so the immediate issue is the FEMA accreditation in Penn 1 and Penn 2. I think everybody here is aware of the fact that those earlier certifications from 2007 end in August of 2013, next month. MCD number 1 and the Sandy SDIC, their period of validity, you've got a little more time on that, but the issue is the same that's facing those districts. And the other part of that is that the FEMA mapping schedule about how to take these certifications and so on, it's not clear what FEMA's schedule is going to be for addressing the firm mapping, the remapping process. FEMA did tell us they are not planning to do this in 2013, so the earliest would be 2014. Obviously, the cost of the levee repairs fairly substantial and significant. You're all aware of the stormwater fee structure and how the city kind of redid their structure on there, and then you've got these broader emerging trends. So we were asked to address these issues, to canvass the stakeholders within the districts, and to collect up these and other issues that they saw. And again, what I'm going to present here is the results of those interviews. Okay, worst case scenario is the failure to maintain that FEMA accreditation. If that occurs, the consequence for residents within the districts is the loss of their eligibility for federally subsidized flood insurance. Now, associated with that is that if you have a federal loan or a federally backed mortgage some way, shape, or form, federally backed mortgages require you to have flood insurance. Those folks that cannot afford insurance in the private market in the loss of those federally subsidized loans could potentially lose their property if the banks were to close the loans, call the loans. And then finally is if some of the districts you guys have the option to dissolve, as you all know. If that were to occur, the map holder, under FEMA regulations, the map holder becomes either one of the cities or Multnomah County, depending on whose territory the levy in question resides in. That goes for the map holder responsibilities. What we're not sure about is what happens to debts, assets, contractual obligations, and all that. Where does that stuff go? And presumably it goes to either the city or the county or whatever. So that's something that's going to take a little bit more investigation. But the point is it has to land somewhere. So the responsibilities for this is going to end up somewhere else if it's not resolved with the folks here in the room. Okay, purpose of this report then was to assess these issues facing the districts, get a cross-cut from the stakeholders on their perceptions. At the front of the list was the FEMA accreditation. Other folks had other issues and topics they brought up during the course of our conversations. We were specifically asked to identify and address issues of governance. What I'm going to talk about here for governance are options that were suggested by the various interview respondents we had. This is not an all-inclusive list. Those of you in the room we did not talk to can probably come up with other ideas of your own or a hybrid of what we're going to say here. So as Reed mentioned in his opening comment, this is the start of the conversation. It's intended to prime the pump on these future discussions, but not necessarily be the answer or an answer to how all you may want to proceed. Identify perspectives. One thing we were asked is to identify other potential stakeholders. Who else ought to be part of this collaborative process moving forward? What might their interest be? We were asked to identify resources and ask folks about what kind of resources people could bring and all. And we didn't really get a clean answer on that. We sort of ended up, those of you that were in the conversations, the obvious stuff was mentioned. The municipalities, the county, and so on, they have their budgets and so on and so forth. But in terms of identifying sources of revenue beyond the obvious, we really didn't have much to report there. And then finally, identify some alternatives for moving forward. Now, Reed mentioned this in his opening comments, but one of his driving purposes of this report is to have it served as the starting conversation for a collaborative process, or what Steve and I are referring to as a collaborative project, to move forward to solve the immediate issues with the levy accreditation and then address some of these other broad cross-cutting issues that are facing the districts. Okay, so findings. Finding number one. Now this is going to sound like an effort to suck up to the client, guys. Okay, but overwhelmingly, everybody we talked to expressed enormous confidence in MCDD1, the staff here, their competence, their cost effectiveness, their good neighbor policies in working with the districts out here. And that was across the board, and we didn't even ask that. That was just volunteered as we were going through the conversations. Even the most ardent critics of the way things are running out here now were very complimentary of the way the district operates, with the exception of the tree removal issue in 2007, which still has some lingering hard feelings, as you all are well aware. With regard to the levy accreditation certification, everybody recognized the need to address this, but it was relayed to us that within the public out here, there's a tendency to view this as a knee-jerk reaction to Katrina. And the implication is just a bureaucratic, unnecessary, arbitrary standards that are being imposed on the districts out here that may not be necessary. Some folks have relayed to us that in talking about some of these public perspectives, that maybe the right approach here is to quote-unquote go political and look for a way to overrule the Corps and FEMA in some of these requirements coming out here. My personal advice to the boards would be that's a bad idea. I think you could spend a lot of time in that. I would personally suggest to you that trying to get somebody in the administration or somebody in a political position to overrule the technical recommendations of the Corps of Engineers in the face of Katrina, the flooding in the Missouri, and Sandy, I mean, that person puts themselves at enormous risk for taking that kind of position. So again, the personal opinion here, my advice would be to take a look at what's being asked for here and figure out how to move ahead with that. And by the way, with regard to this, the Corps has been in the flood control business since the 1920s, and FEMA's been involved since as long as FEMA's been around. Since the 1920s, the Corps routinely takes lessons learned from the events that it faces, rolls that into its design procedures and memoranda and all this kind of good stuff, and is constantly evolving their rules and standards and requirements here. So a lot of folks conflate the current changes that y'all are facing with Katrina, when in fact some of these were in place long before Katrina happened. And it's reasonable to expect you will have future changes going forward as new information comes available, and the Corps feels they need to update their standards, to meet for purposes of public safety. Okay, Corps programs. Now, again, this is in the report mainly to get folks to the same, if you'll excuse the expression, but the same waterline of understanding about what folks are about. The Corps has a number of programs with regard to levee maintenance and levee safety and all that kind of stuff. There's two here that are relevant for the purpose of this discussion. One is their levee safety program, and related and embedded in that is the rehabilitation and inspection program. FEMA, on the other hand, is involved and focused on their National Flood Insurance Program, which is based on the flood insurance rate maps, and that in turn is based on documentation that certifies that the levees have the integrity to support the types of flood events for which the insurance is intended. And these are different programs, and they're focused on different events. And I'm not sure everybody that we talk to, or at least folks we talk to, may have understood this, but they relay that a number of them, the public, tend to get these kind of confused in their own minds and all may not fully understand it. So I want to use this diagram to kind of explain this. This is your riverbed. This is the normal, usually almost always non-flood water surface. You have your levee sitting here, and you've got the property that's protected back over here. The FEMA program is focused on a 1% probability of occurrence flood event. In days of yore, this was referred to as the 100-year flood. Both FEMA and the Corps have gotten away from that terminology because it leads you to think that these floods are only going to happen once every century. And that is not true. It's basically you have a 1% statistical probability of that event occurring in a year. So you could have it potentially occurring multiple times in 1 year or in sequential years. It's not just a once-in-a-century type event. That's their so-called base flood is the terminology they use in their regulations. For the Corps then, the Corps on the other hand is has a Corps design water surface which is intended to cover the full range of flood events that the region could realistically anticipate. The worst event was the flood of 1896, and that is termed the flood of record for the Portland area. So the levees and so on are kind of designed to that standard. We have the freeboard between that upper water level and the top of the levee embankment. Up until 2000, the Corps had freeboard as a design term of art, and it not only allowed but encouraged encroachments such as utility lines and things like that through that area. In 2000, they revised that. They dropped the use of freeboard as a technical term and no longer allow those kind of encroachments through the levees. The reason for that is that your predictions and ability to anticipate what a certain flood event might be is not an exact science. And so this allows for a little bit of extra padding, if you will, safety buffer there in the event the predictions are wrong. And so they took the idea of encroachments in that area off of there. Now, if somebody other than the Corps puts material on top of the levee, that's referred to as overbuild, and that's perfectly okay. And encroachments are allowed in the overbuild as long as they're reviewed and properly permitted. So for example, I think there's a parking area up by the Bridgeton neighborhood that's done on overbuild in that area. Within the FEMA program, a significant change is the designation of the flood area. It used to be to the waterside toe of the levee. Their new criteria takes it to the landside toe of the levee. Now that has implications for the folks who have buildings and so on that are sitting on the levee or in close proximity to the levee. And I think that's all I want to say about that. So anyway, so the report goes into this. It refers to the Corps and FEMA documents that support this information so folks can look to that if they got additional questions or want to follow that up a little bit further on. Now, these are separate programs for separate purposes, but they're not operated in entire isolation from each other. So for example, for the National Flood Insurance Program accreditation, the documentation for that may be done by either the Corps of Engineers or a licensed civil engineer. If the Corps does it, the Corps' guidance for meeting for that process is Engineer Circular 6067, which was just issued in 2010. One of the requirements in Engineer Circular 6067 is that if the Corps had done a certification prior to that point for NFIP, And if that certification, the state of the levee that may have gotten a positive certification prior to this no longer meets the EC 6067 criteria, then that certification gets pulled back. The levee has to be brought to compliance with 6067. That's the issue facing Penn 1 and Penn 2. Okay, that the core certification will become invalid in next month. For SDIC and MCDD number 1, you've got a 10-year period of validity from the time in 2007 when that was done, and so you've got until 2017 before you have to address that particular issue. Now, the other part is that FEMA is not limited to documents specifically developed for its accreditation process. They may use the results of the RIP inspections or any of the other core inspections that might inform their decision and determination on what regarding accreditation. Now, the loss in the expiration of the certification does not mean an immediate end to the accreditation. That accreditation is based on FEMA redoing its FIRM maps, its flood and insurance rate maps. Once they decide to do that, it averages 2 to 3 years for the whole process to play out. It can happen in as soon, something less than 2 years, but normally, usually, almost always, what FEMA tells us, it takes 2 to 3 years to get through that particular process. Okay, tree removal, you're all aware of this, I'm not going to spend time on it, other than make the point that there's still some lingering hard feelings about how that was handled among the public out here. I think everybody recognizes it was not done as sensitively as it could be, and everybody, Reed in particular is focused pretty much on not repeating that particular set of circumstances, but I'll just leave that there. Same thing with stormwater fee assessments. We've put some information in the report that talks in a bit of detail about this because, again, not everybody has the same level of understanding about what is involved with that. In terms of emerging trends, I mentioned this earlier on, but these 3 events seem to have put the MCD operation into the public eye in terms of both the city bureaus and the people that live out here in the area. Where before it was kind of MCD did its thing, and as long as people stayed dry, they pretty much happy with the results there. Those 3 events occur within the context of some of these other trends that are listed here. I'm not going to go through these in detail. I do want to talk a bit about the demographics, the relation between demographics and the regulatory regime, and that is that as you all know, I mean, the land use within the district's area has changed dramatically over the years, from being primary agricultural to getting more industrial, and now we've got a lot more residences coming in. And additionally, with the population growth in Portland and the local municipalities, population growth within the districts, you're starting to see the actions of one or the other interacting, with each other. So you've got the stormwater issue where you get runoff from development just outside the borders here flowing into the MCDD area. So this is all kind of interrelated. As a result of that, the MCDD staff is faced with more ordinances and requirements and things like that to meet this interaction of effects. Again, that's all I want to say there. Folks, if you have questions on that, we can get to that a little bit later. And finally, there's a number of external effects and events that also could affect operations within MCDD. One is climate change, and interrelated is the climate change in the Columbia River Treaty Review that's underway. Flooding in the Columbia Basin is based on 2 sources. One is snowpack in the mountains, and the other are rain events. The current flood control regime followed by the Corps of Engineers and managed through the reservoir system is designed for the snowpack issue. And so you have state and federal agencies that pay very close attention to the snowpack in the mountains. That runoff is fairly predictable based on the history out here. And so they kind of sort of know how that works, and they operate the reservoirs accordingly. About half of your flood protection for this part of the state, for the lower Columbia, actually is up in Canada. Okay, and as part of that Canadian treaty that's in place, the flood control provisions of that treaty, there's certain provisions that will expire in 2024 unless they're decided to be continued. And that is the source and the center of this conversation about the Columbia River Treaty Review that's now underway. I think a number of you guys participated in some of the public information sessions regarding that. Depending on how that plays out, and in the face of the potential trends of more rainfall and less snow as projected due to climate change, you could see a difference in the flow regimes that are down here in the lower part of the Columbia, which could affect the maintenance and the operation of your levee system here. And then these are some other issues that came up during the conversation, but I don't think they really merit any further discussion here. Okay, we went into a bit on funding. Again, just to meet that idea of waterline discussion section of the report. You guys, I think, are probably familiar with this, so I'm not going to go into more detail here unless you all have questions on it. And then on the issues of governance. Now, we were asked to address this. Throughout this whole report, what Kelly and I did was basically just either reported on the information we got from our interview respondents or cited information we got from Corps and FEMA documents or whatever our source material might be. This was the exception, and at Reed's specific request, he asked that we do some advantages, concerns kind of analysis to add to what folks that we interviewed said. So what I'm going to share with you here is our judgment in addition to what we gleaned from our interview respondents. By the way, this is not all-inclusive. If we talk, like I say, we talked to 15 people, came up with 4 alternative governance things. If we had talked to a 16th person or 17th person, invariably we would have gotten another option here, or another suite of concerns or benefits or whatever. So this is just for the purpose of initiating the conversation going forward. It is not intended as an all-inclusive suite of the alternatives, and it's certainly not an all-inclusive suite of potential costs and benefits or concerns kind of thing. So with that, we start with a description of the current governance structure. We do some strengths and concerns with that. I'm going to highlight those here. Basically, the current structure, the districts are very compatible with current land use. As you all well know, you're all set up around whatever the land use base is within your particular districts. And so it's very responsive to the needs of the institutions that are set up within there. This has led to some pretty successful management of routine business. I mean, you guys, in general have done a really good job with maintaining things. So it's the old argument, if it ain't broke, don't try to fix it. One of the strengths that some of our respondents talked about was the value of having voting by acreage, based on acreage. The logic of that, as we understood it, is that since the fees are assessed on either impermeable surface, the area of impermeable surface within the district, or in total acreage, the folks that are paying the bills, it makes sense to have them kind of, having say-sos in how things run. This is not a universally accepted position, and I'll get to that a little bit further on. Everybody likes the idea of the cost structure within MCDD, that it's generally low when viewed in comparison of the unionized rate structures in the cities and the work rules and things like that that go with unionized labor. General sense is the cost here is lower than it would be otherwise. Related to that is the responsiveness and competence of the MCD staff. A number of folks talked about their good neighbor policy. So if an MCD guy is out there with the backhoe working on Project X and somebody needs something done over here, they tend to be very responsive in responding to that. The folks that experienced that were highly complimentary of that kind of flexibility in the staff workforce. Good working relationships across the board. Obviously, MCD then provides a uniform approach to the 4 districts, but there are concerns with this. Number one concern is the voting based on acreage. There are a number of folks who think this is undemocratic, that there's a bias toward business interest, which, as folks were introducing themselves, perhaps that's a little evident as to why people might have that perspective, and that there ought to be a different way to vote on this. This begs the question of whether the Oregon statute would allow that change to occur. If you look at ORS 547, the decision to create or not create a district is based on the acreage, the owners of the acreage in there on an acreage type basis. We did not dig into whether that extended to other decision making within the districts. It might be there, it might not be there, but somebody's got to look into that if you all decide you do want to pursue a different voting piece, it may either require a change in Oregon statute or an exception to that. Yeah.
Just a question, you described that some of the support or concern with the voting structure being those that are paying the bill ought to be able to control what it does. Was there any discussion about those that have the investment that's represented by that increased acreage having perhaps a greater interest in terms of a $30 million investment in something versus somebody that has a condo or something?
No, didn't get into that. Okay. One of the concerns was a lack of transparency and oversight in the current process. So, for example, the tree removal piece came up in this quite a bit. That the boards were the way the respondent put it, the boards were perceived as providing, you guys do the fee structure piece, you collect that, but MCDD is pretty much up to its own as to how it goes about carrying out its duties, and there's no real direct oversight over what MCDD does. And this was partially attributed to the approach to the 2007 tree removal, which one respondent said was very cavalier on the part of the district, and it caused some hard feelings. Now, I think the staff here eventually overcame that and fixed that in the eyes of the public, but we do have that lingering issue, and that was the generalization of that particular example. A couple of you guys mentioned the lack of a holistic planning capacity. Right now, it's very well set up for routine business, but this idea of thinking forward and how do you integrate with these different trends and issues that are facing the districts here beyond just the maintenance of the levies, current structure doesn't really allow for that in a real way. A couple folks mentioned the lack of public awareness and interest, and even if the public's interested, there isn't a lot of opportunity for interacting with what the MCDD staff does other than through the supervisory boards. Okay, we were asked to identify additional groups in interest. There's a list of what were identified to us in the report. These came with 4 caveats, one being that not all the groups listed have necessarily an interest in everything going on in all 4 districts, and those that do may not have interest in everything facing any individual type district. Coupled with that is the limited capacity to participate. So if these groups were to participate in 4 different district event meetings or however you all operate your business and be expected to do that and cover all the issues that are out here they may be interested in, there's a staff capacity problem for the folks to do that. Coupled with that is your own limitations on time. As you all noted in your introductions, all the board members have real jobs they have to spend time on, and I think most of you guys serve in a voluntary, unpaid capacity. So by expanding this group of interest, you're going to expand the interest to get brought into the districts, which is going to require more time potentially on board members' parts in being knowledgeable and conversant in the different issues these different groups could bring in. So those caveats were offered, again, by our respondents as we went through this, and then you can see the list in the report of the groups they suggested. The implication for Reed and Company is that at a minimum, there's a need for a public outreach and education program to keep these interests informed of what's going on, so that if there's an event in which they may want to engage, there's a way they can trigger that engagement, be involved early on, and have some kind of meaningful way to participate. Our governance options that were identified, first is consolidating all the boards into one. And I'm just going to flip these through here. I'm watching the clock here, and I want to give Steve his time, and plus you guys got other business here. But there's advantages, concerns on this. Again, these aren't intended to be all-inclusive, but just reflect either our judgment or what was relayed to us by our various respondents. I'll give you guys a chance to look through that. And then the concerns with the consolidation idea, what I mentioned before about if you change the voting, you're going to have to study whether or not that requires a change in statute. Loss of economies and scale, what I mean by that is that one of the values and benefits of having local governance districts dealing with local issues is that responsiveness and effectiveness in dealing with local groups. If you consolidate this up into a broader single board, you may lose some of that ability to deal with that effectively with the different issues faced that are currently handled by each of the individual boards. And let me go back one. Okay, the next option then was the creation of a separate planning district. So this option would keep the 4 districts as they're currently constructed, but put some kind of planning entity over the top to deal with some of these broader strategic holistic issues. And the advantages, again, I'll just flip these up here. Big 2, number 1, you're dealing with that issue of the holistic planning, and you're retaining the benefits that people see in the current structure. The challenge is that that staff's going to have to come from somewhere. So you're probably dealing with either an extension of the staff here with the MCDD staff to handle the strategic planning function, or perhaps creating some new staff structure for that planning for this new planning district board. Okay, option 3 is this improved coordination, and this is the current path you're on here. And this obviously has the advantage of the current structure stuff, little increase in cost. Challenge is that it only modestly addresses some of these other concerns people have raised about the governance structure. And last is this idea of integrating the current functions of MCDD into the city or county structures. And by cities, I'm talking about not just Portland, but the other municipalities that have a stake here, and the county for the unincorporated areas. There's an advantage on here. One of the comments was made about MCD cost and the perception that if the city takes this on with a unionized workforce, costs would increase. And the concern would be then that those costs would be reflected in the residents out here in the region. But another way to think about that is, even though that cost may objectively increase, if that's distributed across the entire taxpayer base of Portland and the other municipalities, overall costs may go up, but the cost per household may actually go down, or the cost per business could potentially go down. I don't know how that math works. It's just an observation that we made in relation to that would require some additional study. Big challenge here is nobody wants to do this. Nobody we talked to thought this was a good idea, okay? Basically, this is the part of our worst case scenario, that if everything falls apart, this is where things end up going, with consequences for the cities as well as for the residents out here, the districts. I talked about perceived cost, and what happens to the elected district boards in this circumstance is somewhat unclear. Obviously you would lose a lot of the control over how you all do business here if these guys were to go away and those functions be performed by the city itself. Okay, in terms of next steps then, a number of folks talked about how this structure has been a role model, a model that's been carried out to other parts of the country, and look as how to manage flood districts and levee districts and things of that nature. Given the recent flooding in the Missouri, given the recent floods and the hurricane up in Sandy and Hurricane Katrina, there's other districts who have faced very significant flood events around the country, and there may be lessons to be learned, to reverse the process. There may be lessons learned as those guys are dealing with issues of governance, issues of management that could benefit you all out here. So one thought is to conduct a case study about some of these changes in other parts of the country and see what might be relevant and applicable to the districts out here. The second thing, in the report you guys have, this is referred to as a series of workshops. Steve and I were talking yesterday, and the notion of workshops is really inadequate for what we're trying to say here. So we're going to revise that and do a revised written report on here, because what we're really talking about is a collaborative project that has four basic components to it. The first one, the most immediate, is the Penn 1, Penn 2 situation. The second one, as severe as the first, but a little bit more time to deal with it, is the other two districts' levy accreditation. The fee equity issue, the argument made by the city when they imposed the change in fee structure was that there are non-direct expenses like the big pipe project and things like that are borne by other taxpayers that the folks out here didn't necessarily have rolled into their fee assessments. So in the name of equity, that was thought that could be shared. MCD came back and said, well, wait a minute, you got the flood protection here from the levees, you've got your airport here, you've got your emergency water supply here, you've got all this other stuff out here. You guys are gaining a benefit from the flood protection provided by the levees for which you do not pay. So how about some reciprocity here in the interest of equity? My understanding is that the city has kind of responded to that in a positive way. But the next step is going to be to work out the mechanics of how that might be negotiated and worked out with either the city, the county, the state, or whoever might be involved with that. And then finally, the fourth component would be these issues of governance on here. Now, all of these I don't think can happen at the same time because they will involve the same people. And so you've got a staff management, time management issue. And so there's a sequencing, phasing here conversation that has to take place about how to set that up. That's the subject for a future conversation. And finally, we talked about outreach and education. Additionally, as we went through our interviews, there are a bunch of issues that people brought up, a bunch of questions they asked that we just did not have time in the budget we had to answer. So in section 5.4, there's a list of these additional inquiries just to find a place, a home for those so people can pick that stuff up later on. And with that, that's it. So let me open the door for whatever clarifying questions you have, and then we'll turn the floor over to Steve. Questions, comments, observations, war stories, or testimonials?
And we'll also have an opportunity for questions after Steve's piece as well. So I did want to point out two things. One, the work that was done here really helped us to get on the same page as the board. I know that Rick shared the information that he put in his presentation and in the report with the board to get their feedback. That helped us to start speaking the same language better than we ever had before. So I just want to talk about that as a cascading effect. It was just very powerful. The second piece is when it comes to governance, the reason why I pushed on this a little bit is we're asking others to change. We're asking cities, state, counties, others to think differently. and think about their responsibilities. And the reason why I pushed on governance a little bit is to say we're willing to change if it benefits the community. And we're asking you to do the same. So it opens up the conversation a little bit to put all the options on the table from all sides. So that's part of the reason why I pushed the governance thing. The only other thing I'd like to point out is you have two different presentations, two different reports. Why are there two different reports? Why are there two different presentations? I'm being pointed at. The Oregon Solutions presentation and report is very focused. It's about Penn 1 and Penn 2 reaching accreditation. The reason why we have the second report and presentation and the interviews associated with it is we have a lot bigger issues that affect all 4 districts and that go beyond the specific issues of Penn 1 and Penn 2 and accreditation. So that's why they are separate, and I just want to point that out.
Anything from any of the board members? Sir.
I thought the report was exceedingly well done. It's the comment I have. Very well done.
Thank you. Well, I do have a request, though. That electronic copy you all got, delete that. Because it talks about the workshops. We're going to revise that. There's some other editorial catches we had. So we're going to do a revised final dated today, depending on how this conversation plays out here. That'll be out, if not today, by Monday. And that's the one that can be shared with the public, or whatever you all want to do with that. We're also, part of the contract was to have printed copies of that made up, and we'll be sending those to a printer to have those there should people want to have a hard copy beyond what you run off on your computer. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Steve. And
thanks, Rick. Thank you, Rick.
Great. Thanks, Rick, for setting the stage. I will reintroduce myself. I'm Steve Greenwood. I am from the Oregon Solutions Program, which is part of the National Policy Consensus Center at Portland State University. And some of you are familiar, I know, with Oregon Solutions projects and processes. We've done probably about 60 of them throughout the state now, and we're in that role, we are kind of almost an adjunct office of the governor's office. The governor designates Oregon Solutions projects, really creates a sense that this is whatever is an Oregon Solutions project is a statewide priority. And I think one of the philosophies around Oregon Solutions is that Oregon has traditionally had a unique and I would say uniquely collaborative way of doing business and really getting to solutions. And that's what we try to do. We facilitate bringing folks to the table. We provide a neutral forum where all the key stakeholders can come to the table and work on something collaboratively, not just to plan, but really to make the kind of commitments so that the project can be implemented and things actually get done collaboratively. So we'll talk more about that in a moment, but that's who we are. And one of the key questions that we had as we were asked to take a look at this is, does the Peninsula 1 and Peninsula 2 district situation with respect to accreditation, does that lend itself, does it require, would there be value added in bringing the key stakeholders together at a neutral forum to really discuss what needs to happen and how it's going to actually be implemented? Along with that, does Oregon Solutions provide value by bringing the governor's designation, a governor-designated convener, a neutral forum, and the process facilitation and support for the collaborative process? So those are the questions that I was really trying to answer as I began to interview, and I interviewed, I know, a number of you here in the room, but also a number of other key stakeholders as well. So the first thing that we try to do in our process assessments is really try to frame what the heck is this project? What really are the project goals? And after talking to all the stakeholders, we identified really 4 major project goals. And I want to talk a little bit about that first one. First one says identify, fund, and implement the necessary improvements so that the levees are protective of a 1% chance flood. And the short version of that would be to attain certification. But I want to really emphasize that as I talk to folks, the people in those districts and the other stakeholders said, you know, this isn't just a bureaucratic exercise. We do, in fact, want to make sure that the levees can protect that 1% chance flood. So it's not just about certification. It's not just about accreditation. There's a desire to make sure that the darned levees work and that they're protective. Certainly, as Rick has already talked about, one of the goals is to maintain, I should say, accreditation, and that you don't have the area behind the levees being considered a significant flood hazard area for all the reasons that Rick talked about. The third goal is transparency, that the residents and property owners are involved. And I want to be really clear here that the Oregon Solutions process does bring key stakeholders to the table, but it is not by itself a public participation process. In all of the projects that we've had, I would say at least 50%, maybe more, have involved a public participation process that the key stakeholders around the table, around the Oregon Solutions table say, yeah, you know, we need to have a couple of public meetings and we figure out who's responsible for organizing those and all of that. But the Oregon Solutions process is not by itself a public participation process. And the last project goal, and again, Rick talked about this, but I want to reemphasize for Peninsula 1 and Peninsula 2, to meet the Corps of Engineers standards to stay in the rehabilitation and inspection program. 2 reasons for that. One is there are benefits, as Rick explained, you know, in terms of protecting yourselves in terms of flood events and damage from flood events to be in that RIP program, but also that FEMA has made it clear that being in that RIP program is what they call, and I will use quotes here, an indicator of eligibility for accreditation. So, so those are the goals that we identified, yes.
So you identified them through the interviews?
Yes.
Or were you given the goals?
No, I identified, this is my version, this is my summary based upon the interviews that I conducted. That's correct.
And then when you said that the Oregon Solution isn't particularly an citizen involvement function, so is it what is it then? It's a problem-solving little group that just puts their head on a problem and then issues a report? Or like what? It's sort of like, so could you describe more philosophically what it is that Oregon Solutions does as a
right? So
they're how they add value, and
right.
then we're applying to this.
So let's go to that top bullet there. Identify, fund, and implement necessary improvements. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that came out of this assessment. But the 2 districts, Peninsula 1 and Peninsula 2, could say, well, we're just going to do this on our own. We're going to identify what those, what we need to do. We're going to hire a consulting engineer. We're going to fund them on our own, and we're going to implement them. But there is a sense that the scale of those improvements in and of themselves may be more than just what the 2 districts can do on their own, and that there may be a need to involve other stakeholders. For example, the City of Portland, or the Port of Portland, or Metro, or some of the other key stakeholders. Well, how do you get those people together to, first of all, agree about what they want to do together? How do you get those people together to decide who's going to pay how much and who's going to be responsible for what aspects of the project? And what we have found now over 60 projects is that having a neutral forum and the staff support that Oregon Solutions provides brings representatives from all of those key stakeholder groups together. And it is not just the Penn 1 or Penn 2 table. It's not just Penn 1 saying, we want you guys to help us solve our problem. It is the governor saying this is really an issue of statewide importance. And all those stakeholders coming together and saying, we all share this problem. This isn't just one entity's problem. This is our problem. And we're going to figure out together how to solve it. And one of the things that the Oregon Solutions processes always end with is a signed, non-legally binding, but it's proven pretty effective, declaration of cooperation. And that declaration of cooperation lays out what everybody agrees as what they want to do, and who's going to do what kind of, if you will, the governance structure and the commitments, so that if there is a number that the total needs to be in terms of the financial resources or other kinds of resources to get the job done, there's a signed set of commitments on we're willing to do the following things. We're willing to put this much money in. We're willing to provide this engineering support. We're willing to, whatever it may be. So that's what comes out of the Oregon Solutions process. Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Okay. All right. Any other questions on this? So what we found, not totally surprising given, I think, also some of the conversations that Rick has described, is first of all that there was an understanding among key stakeholders about there's a lot at stake here, and that if things go badly, that people will be affected in some fairly significant ways, that some of these key stakeholder groups will be affected in some fairly significant ways. So everybody, in fact, feels like they have an interest to make sure that this is successful. Secondly, that as I talked to folks, they all felt having a table where the key stakeholders could sort of more formally come together and talk through this. And I would add, talk through it starting at an early stage in the process would be really helpful. And the term that I heard more than once was, if we have that, we think that this is going to go a lot more smoothly than if we don't have it. I heard that over and over. The third thing I would say is that people felt like people got the notion of a neutral forum. People understood that having this be something other than just, Multnomah Drainage District or Penn 1 or Penn 2, calling people together to say, help us solve our problem, that had some benefit, and having the governor's designation, people felt might help bring the right people to the table, and as we like to say in Oregon Solutions, help them act like grown-ups once they get to the table. So, I did not get a contrary note on this. I didn't have anybody say, oh man, this would be terrible and it would be a waste of time. But there were a number of issues that got raised. And some of those issues probably need to be resolved before the collaborative process or in designing the collaborative process. And some of them need to be resolved during the collaborative process. So the first issue is what's required? What's going to be needed to get accreditation? And it is not clear. It is not absolutely clear what the scale of improvements are that are going to be needed for accreditation. Now, there's some hints, but the short version of this is that when we spoke to FEMA and/or when we spoke to the Corps of Engineers, no one wanted to say, well, here's the list of 18 things that you need to do in order to get accreditation. And part of that is because they sort of have this process and they want to honor the process and they don't want to get out ahead of that. The other thing that became clear is that it is not just a math exercise. It's not just sort of adding up the calculations and saying, okay, here are the 14 things that you need to do. It's not so prescriptive. The FEMA standards are very general and they're very performance-based. We do know that that FEMA uses the Corps' Rehabilitation and Inspection Program status as one of their indicators, although even there, it never says in any of the literature that it is a requirement. It only says that it is an indicator. So that's one of the things that needs to be a part of this process. What it says is that FEMA and the Corps of Engineers need to be at the table, at the collaborative table. Second issue is the timeline. And Rick has already talked about this, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But, if you have stuff that you need to do in Peninsula 1 and Peninsula 2, how soon does it need to be done? And the answer at this point is pretty squishy. So when I first began this assessment, my sense was, oh my gosh, they need to have all this stuff done by August 15th of 2013, and that I was quickly disabused of that notion. And in our discussions with FEMA, they made it clear, number one, this issue is not just happening here in Portland. This is going on all over the country. And frankly, the unofficial word or the unofficial message that I got was that there are other places in the country where they have much greater concern than in Peninsula 1 and Peninsula 2. But that said, if you're a major property owner in Peninsula 1 and Peninsula 2, you're kind of hanging out there because they could at any moment say, okay, we're going to begin the remapping process. The indication, as Rick said, the indication, again, unofficially at this point, is that that's probably not going to happen, at least in the next year, within the next 12 months. But there are, frankly, there are no guarantees of that. The one other thing that if I were sitting out there that I would be a little concerned about is that once they begin the remapping process, there's only 6 months before the required documentation needs to be submitted. So at that point, you need to have whatever it is you're going to get done. So I would argue that even though the timeline is unclear, it's probably not, the appropriate response is probably not, well, let's just sort of sit back and wait till we hear from them at this point. Yeah.
When you say required documentation, by that do you mean documenting that it has been completed?
Yes, certification. And certification means that that the levee is protective of that 1% flood.
Maybe an extension of Mike's question would be, and maybe you don't have the answer to this, Steve, is does the Corps accept a long-term programmatic plan to complete all the corrective actions over a 5 or 10 year period that can be capitalized and funded in an easier fashion than having all the fixes done within the 6 months? So it's the difference between having a long-term program to implement the fixes versus having all the fixes done in the short term. Do you have a sense of the flexibility that the core
I
allows
have,
districts?
I have a sense of that.
Okay.
But I will start by saying, I think the answer to that is uncertain. But my reading of it, and anybody who wants to give a different opinion is free to do so, but my reading of it is that if FEMA believes that the levee is not currently protective of a 1% flood, you do not get accreditation. There are two pieces of what I think, I know we kind of keep going back between the Corps of Engineers requirements and FEMA's requirements. The way the Corps looks at it, they look at structural stuff and they look at maintenance program as to whether or not things are sufficient. And to some degree, that maintenance program, the reason they look at it is to say not only today it's going to be sound, but over the next 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, that there are going to be maintenance procedures in place so that it doesn't fall apart in the next 5 or 10 years or whatever that time frame may be. So in terms of the maintenance requirements, and now again I'm going to be speaking about the Corps, mostly the Corps' RIP program. They look at that and want to make sure that there is something that will be protective in the future. But they distinguish that from structurally today, is it sound and is it going to be protective? So the short version of my answer is I'm starting with the assumption that if the levee is not deemed protective today, structurally, of a 1% flood, it is not accreditable. Yeah?
Steve, and you maybe talk about this in a minute, but one thing that I don't think is on the timeline that I believe plays into this, and you've heard this before, is that once FEMA decides to remap, we do have the ability to ask for a 2-year extension through their process. Is that correct?
Yeah, the provisionally accredited levy.
So the 6 months is very important, but we are also managing into this knowing that we will have an extension. Because if you're anything like me, you see 6 months, you think, why aren't we working on the levee today? We're managing into this to try to be as efficient as possible while also be very cognizant of the timeline.
I just would add something to that. I think that there is, as they pointed out, this notion of a provisionally accredited levy. My reading of the literature from FEMA is that that 2-year extension or any extension in terms of a provisionally accredited levy is primarily about documentation and about maintenance. And again, I think that there's uncertainty and there's room for some discussion about exactly how that plays out. Once again, I think the bottom line is that it argues for a collaborative process where you've got the key stakeholders, where you've got, the governor's designation, and you have those federal agencies there at the table as well. Let's see, anything? No. Okay, issue number 3. Oh, Dick?
Just a question, as you interviewed and spoke to these other agencies, did you get the feeling that they were willing to come to the table and sit in the meetings? I mean, they've been suspiciously absent so far.
Yes, is the short answer.
Okay.
Coordinating with a consulting engineer. So The districts have a consulting engineer who have Cornforth Consultants that has already begun work. And when we began to do this assessment, we thought about a collaborative process. One of the options that we considered was, well, why don't we just wait until the consulting engineer is done with their results, so the group would have something pretty concrete to talk about. And I think that there are arguments that can be made either to begin something concurrently or to wait. Our ultimate recommendation was, and frankly, I talked about this with a number of the stakeholders, and what everybody seemed to say was, well, wait a minute, we should probably get going soon on this, in part because that engineering look is not just a math exercise, and there needs to be some input from the key stakeholder groups. But secondly, I think that there is a kind of a public interface and outreach aspect to this as well. If you have your consulting engineer sort of off and running, and ultimately then they come in with their results, and then people start to react to that, there's a loss of an opportunity for some preventive maintenance of that process and of the information. And as you'll see in a moment, I think that the public process here is going to be really critical. Whoops, wrong direction. Issue number 4 is, I would call it the $64,000 question, but it may be more like, well, I won't even use a number. But this is really one of the critical questions. And I think that there is an assumption on everybody's part, based primarily on the Corps' 2011 letter in their 2010 inspection, that this could be pretty spendy in order to get accreditation when the remapping process happens. And there is this uncertainty and frankly a little bit of fear about what that number might ultimately look like. Frankly, both of the districts, Penn 1 and Penn 2, are sitting there going, how are we going to, on our own, deal with this? So there's an assumption that there may need to be a collaborative approach to funding the necessary improvements involving the key stakeholders. And, based on my discussions with people, there's an understanding on the part of those key stakeholders that it's in their interest to do a little bit of prevention rather than potentially lose accreditation, because that has even greater economic impacts. But the question then becomes, and this is where from my perspective as a process guy, this is where the fun really begins. What's fair? What's an effective way to distribute those costs among the various stakeholders? And our experience in the past is that a neutral forum is extremely helpful in reaching those kinds of agreements. And sometimes it takes a while to work through that. Sometimes the first time around when people kind of offer what they can do, they come up a little short as a group. And so then they have to kind of go back and take a look at that, and there's a little bit of negotiation that goes on. So that's going to take some time during the process. Yeah, Walter?
So is Oregon Solutions a negotiator?
We're not a negotiator. We may in fact serve a mediation role in that process, facilitation role. That's correct.
So a mediator's different than a negotiator.
Well,
I'm sort of asking a fine point here.
Yeah.
If we've been talking for years, honestly. I really appreciate the governor's thing, and I think this forum is really good. But us just sitting around talking happy probably isn't gonna get some of the concessions that need to be made to have a realistic plan. So as, you know, sometimes just putting the light of day on things helps that. Sometimes having people empowered, you know, at political levels to make nudges in the political ways they need to be done, because this is not an administrative decision. We're trying to figure out how to certify a levy where the certification criteria is ambiguous at best, where the timing's arbitrary, where we just happen to be at the luck of the draw, where nobody has any money, and everybody wants to cover their butt and to make sure the other guy's doing that, including the, we need, you know, it's gonna be a little more pointed to me. And I understand that you have to say but you know, as we get into this, that's the solution where I'm wanting to go. This is all little beginning steps towards the real solution, because this is sort of the end. How do you do unfunded mandates? How do you get government to be reasonable? How do you know, like we have a higher macro level here. You know, the goals that you put up there were just like the goals Dave would have come up with 2 years ago. I mean, none of that. Those aren't out of the box goals. Those are goals that are assuming the solution's the same old problem, same old in the box solution, and then, you know, pretend to have a transparent process in it at the same time. I think that I think Oregon Solutions can still do this, but we need a little bit more of a hammer and not just a buffet, and hoping that simply because we need some breakthroughs that are different than, because the whole mix is arbitrary. All the regulations don't make sense. So this isn't like you say, it's not a math exercise, so we gotta have a solution that's not a math exercise in response.
Well, if I understand you correctly, you would like the governor or the Oregon Solutions person to sort of walk into the mayor's office and say, you guys need to pony up. Is that?
No, I'm not saying it that way. I'm saying that sometime in this process, we're gonna have you, Army Corps of Engineers, you need to get realistic on your timetables. You, FEMA, you need to do this. You, City of Portland, you need to buck up. And that governor could do that, but so could a senator, and so could, you know, like lots of people that might be able to help with that. But yes, sometime, now maybe you're setting the stage for that, but sometime that's gonna have to happen. And some of these, in my opinion, are gonna have people be willing to make regulatory consideration, even if we all want to believe the Army Corps has the right regulations, which,
sure,
you know, we don't know. You know, the accommodations along with Phil saying where we just get time. I mean, sometime just getting 2 more years into the whole cycle might solve this problem. But I just want to make sure that we're really going, you know, there's a real problem here, and it isn't a process problem. It's a political decision-making problem too, and we have to, in my opinion, if we don't get right to that pretty quick, we're not really going to solve this problem. I don't know what pretty quick means. That could be 6 months or a year. I'm not
Yeah,
saying
no,
next week.
I hear you. So I would, first of all, I don't see Oregon Solutions, or the governor in this case, being a negotiator. What I do see the governor and Oregon Solutions and the governor's convener doing is advocating strongly that we get to a solution. And I think that has, in practice, some of the implications that you're talking about. Yeah.
I endorse this because I've experienced the success of Oregon Solutions exactly on your point, which was, I'll give you a solid example, trying to certify industrial property to get zoned and prepared for being available out on the market, East County. Lots of local, state, federal jurisdictions in there, a lot of bureaucratic process, all well-intentioned, all with, you know, authority and all that. Things were dragging along. We engaged Oregon Solutions, City of Gresham, Port of Portland, all sorts of other entities, got everybody at the table, did what we're doing now, which is bringing everybody up to common level of understanding, using the same vocabulary, understanding timeframes, figuring out where the bottlenecks were, applying the political pressure to that group at the table, like we're sitting today, and holding one another accountable to make decisions quicker and in a practical sense where everybody gets to hear about what the issues are and the context and the barriers and the problems that a particular agency has to, it's not necessarily granting a variance. It might be making something a priority at the staff level that currently isn't. Oh, this will take us 180 days. Let's put it to the front of the line. Let's do it in 30 days. And having that peer pressure at the agency jurisdictional level to get things done and keep it moving to a solution and to keep the negotiations going quickly. Oregon Solutions doesn't negotiate, the governor doesn't negotiate. They create a venue and facilitate that. It's a crucible, it's a pressure cooker. You get down and you have to make decisions, and you have to represent an agency or whoever it is, and you keep the pace up till you get to a solution. It's succeeded for us in the experiences that I've had. But it's exactly the point you were making. It's like, what's preventing it from just dragging out and, agencies and bureaucracies just kind of futzing along. It's basically we hold each other accountable in that form.
And this is all a great segue to this, the next issue, which is the regulatory agencies. Even if you get the money together and you've got everybody, on board who wants to make the changes, there are some regulatory processes both at the federal level and the state level that you need to go through. You don't, I would argue that you don't want to get to that point and all of a sudden then get delayed, 3 or 4 years because of a regulatory process. So one of the things that the Oregon Solutions Project would need to do is to make sure that those regulatory agencies are there at the table, that they buy into the goals of the project, and that they sign the declaration just like everybody else in terms of what they're going to do to help coordinate with each other and expedite that regulatory process as much as possible. Number 6, outreach to residents and property owners. I was thinking about this project, and I was thinking that the potential impact to the property owners and residents in the districts involve potentially money that they have to come up with to pay for all of this, property rights in terms of potential changes to property, and simply change in their neighborhood to deal with some of the things that the Corps has identified. Well, all 3 of those are hot button issues, and all 3 of those are things that it would be easy for the rumor mill to get way out in front of you, and then you need to end up playing catch up. So I think that making sure that there is outreach and good communication with property owners and residents is really important. The recommendations in my assessment are that the governor designate the Penn 1 and Penn 2 levies as an Oregon Solutions project. And one of the things I should say right now is that in my discussions with various folks during the interview process, it was clear that a lot of folks who are not in Penn 1 and Penn 2 necessarily see that how those 2 districts manage this issue becomes a kind of prototype for the other districts as well, that there'll be lessons learned, there'll be some communications established with those federal agencies, et cetera. What that designation means is that there would be a high-level convener appointed, that there would be a facilitation staff assigned, and the agencies, particularly state agencies and federal agencies, notified. Yeah.
Let me ask you one.
Sure.
Maybe Reed, you want to contribute, anybody else wants to. I don't know if there are enough differences, but it concerns me that it's limited to Penn 1 and Penn 2. Because it seems to me that this is, as an area, this is a common issue for everybody. It's just a matter of happenstance timing that we're at 2013 and the others at 2017. And I'll put this in the context of, and your report was only 7 pages versus 50 pages on the other one, so I read yours first, and much of which were answered sometimes in the second one. But you know, in the background, it's talking about preserving property and property values in Pen 1 and Pen 2. And I'm troubled with that because I think that's way too easy to be very parochial in terms of its application and people saying, wait a minute, you know, I'm not, you just decided to be there. Really what you're talking about is all the drainage districts, I believe, unless there's some distinctive differences. And I think that makes a much different potential focus for this because looking at the 50-page program, you know, you've got 165,000 jobs, 3,000 businesses, and 20 billion in land value, plus the gateway to Oregon economically and everything else in the airport. I don't know if there's a reason we have to limit this to Pen 1 and Pen 2 since it's the same, as I understand it, more or less the same issue. And I wonder if we're limiting ourselves by making it Pen 1 and 2. We've got the more immediacy, but it's the same issue.
Well, to some degree, that's a decision that you all get to make and a discussion that you may want to have. I'm looking at Reed over here, and I've had some discussions with him about this. Here would be my, and I don't know that we would be opposed to this. A couple of responses. One is that we're going to work very closely with Rick and Phil and their group in terms of, because they're looking at sort of the whole, you know, 4 district-wide sets of issues. The thing that we have found about Oregon Solutions is that collaboration works best when it gets very specific, and it is the people get very real about what exactly needs to happen, what the costs are going to be, and you know, they're like real numbers and real things attached to those commitments. I'm not sure that you're going to have those numbers for all of the districts and kind of the time frame that you need for Pen 1 and Pen 2 to do what they need to do. Maybe you would, but that's not my understanding at this point. I think I'm open to that possibility, but the assumptions that I've made is that you may not be ready to do all of the 4 districts in the time frame that Pen 1 and Pen 2 need to do theirs. But that's a decision that you guys, you know, you can talk about that.
I'd also point out, I'm in trouble. I'd also point out too that, because Vic, I think it's a great point. It's something that we wrestled over quite a bit. That was part of the reason for bringing the Center of CPS, Center for Public Service, into the fold so that we could have that broader conversation at the same time. We've also talked about designs because the way that Oregon Solutions design works, there are subcommittees. And we've talked about how subcommittees could approach other issues that may affect other districts. Mm-hmm. I'd say on top of that, while these 4 districts have a lot in common other than timelines, there's also other places in the state that have these same problems. And we're really the only state that I can find that doesn't have some type of coordination at a statewide level. So I'd also say that there is probably value in another type of collaboration that goes beyond just these 4 districts. So I'm agreeing with you. It's there are different ways to go forward with this, and we can continue to talk about them.
Yeah, again, the charge I was given was to look at Pen 1 and Pen 2, but if you all decide that there's a way to do this effectively with all 4.
Point as far as identifying exact costs of things, even though we're not going to ask the exercise, but you're right, we won't have them.
Yeah.
So that's,
Well, Vic, it also seems to me that it's easier to tackle Pen 1 and Pen 2 as a project and come to a solution where everybody's happy. That's going to be a very powerful template.
Yeah.
Would probably most likely be agreeable to the other
I think as long as people recognize that you're dealing with a larger issue, I guess, and the economics are not limited to what's contained in these, and there's some different issues. So.
Yeah, what solution may be appropriate for 1 and 2 may need to scale up.
Yeah.
Well, to play a little devil's advocate on it, I was a partner of the city of Portland, and I'm just gonna figure out what I was gonna be hit up for all this levy stuff, to then just know Penn 1 and Penn 2 and not have a clue that MCDD2 is gonna be $10 billion more and not have that be part of how I'm planning from the get-go, to me, seems like a hard way for them to have buy-in. And then to throw one more idea into this, since I think the 2013 and the 2015 are just arbitrary numbers, you know, that are just the luck of the draw. I know that they're real numbers at one level, but you know, a stroke of a pen, maybe we blend all those to 2017 so we can work on it together in a reasonable manner. That's why I'm saying some of this is a political decision. And I've been enough to talk to the Army Corps and all this sort of stuff, though, you know, if you want to know where the neighborhood feels about some of this stuff, we talked about being fact-based early on. Most of the neighborhood people don't believe that many of the criteria and many of the attitudes of the Army Corps are fact-based. They seem like a one-size-fits-all for the whole nation. And you probably heard that in your comments, but I've had that personally in my experience. There's one way to build a levee, it's how we build it in the Midwest. And that's how all levees are, or they're not certified. And you know, now I don't believe we're going to change them on that. So don't get me wrong. We thought we could change them. We've spent years trying to change them. I've talked enough to know, well, I don't think we're going to change them. They're going to win. So the game then is, how long do we get to that standard? And so if we already know we need more time, well, why aren't we talking about getting, you know, see, this is so to me, the political strategy should be to not, you know, to figure out which of these sacred cows need to be challenged, and if it takes our governor to call up whoever needs to call up, then make the call, if we have this agreement, and shift some of these timetables, and so maybe putting them all together makes that case. So I'm looking at that, because I think that these are unrealistic things for us to meet, and so I think we need to work on that as soon as possible.
Steve, if I could, one of the things I want to point out is there are multiple strategies working at the same time. One of the things that the city has stepped up to do is recently in the Conference of Mayors, the National Conference of Mayors, one of the few resolutions that our mayor brought to the Conference of Mayors is a resolution that requests FEMA and the Corps to clarify on timelines and give the appropriate amount of time for communities to manage into these processes. Not disagreeing with improving our levees, but creating an amount of time that would be appropriate for us to manage into them. And our congressional delegation is also working on that as well. So I would say that we are already started on it, and we're doing it as a parallel path. What I don't want to do is do that first and then do this, because then I feel like I'd be putting property owners at risk. So we're doing parallel tracks.
So the one last thing I want to mention about the designation as an Oregon Solutions project is that Oregon Solutions does not usurp the authority of the districts. These projects remain the district's projects. What Oregon Solutions does is manage and help organize the collaborative process. So, so that in fact there's buy-in by all the key stakeholders. So I just want to, that's always a question, and I just want to clarify that. Whoops. Recommendation number 2 is that this really happened in 2 phases. And this goes back to one of the issues that I raised before. I really recommend that this begin sooner rather than later, and that the first phase is really about what is it that we need to do, and the collaborative process, including the federal agencies, people coming together saying, okay, these are the things that we want to do, and the timetable that we need to get them done in. And then a second phase is really the implementation. Now that we know what that number is, you know, what's the implementation plan, who's going to pay what, you know, what are the regulatory agencies going to do in terms of of their processes and how are they going to coordinate those and expedite those. Recommendation number 3 is really the participants, and it's in my report. I don't think that there are any big surprises here. We just need to make sure, and this may not be all-inclusive, and if people feel like we're missing something, this is probably not the time to say that, but I'm very open to hearing if there are folks that you think need to be at the table, either to get the necessary political buy-in, but as importantly, if other entities have resources to bring to the solution, we need to consider those. And last, the timeline, I'm really thinking that in order to get started and to coordinate this with the consulting engineer, that we want to really get started in September, probably late September, which would mean that sometime in August we would have the governor designate this, should the boards want to go that route as an Oregon Solutions project. And with that, I hope I haven't taken up too much of the other time in the meeting, but
I think this was great. One of the things I wanted to point out, since you were all budget focused, we just went through this over the last couple of months. The total cost represents what is expected to be a shared cost, not just coming from the districts. Secondly, this first phase was provided by the governor's office and paid for the cost of the assessment, which was great. I also wanted to point out, as I did with Rick and the work that Rick and Kelly did, the cascading benefits of this come in a couple different ways. One is there are some very influential people either associated with Oregon Solutions or its sister program, Regional Solutions, that helps bring this into much greater visibility, including Commissioner Fish, who sits on, I believe, the Regional Solutions Board, some of the executives at the Port of Portland. It's great that they're seeing this as a high-level project. Secondly, and I remember Walter and I talking last September on the eve of the City Commission's vote, and the thought that we were going to lose leverage in the conversation of the levies once this vote passes. And not surprising, for all the phone calls that I made to strategic partners out there, I got some calls back. When Steve started doing his work, everybody called back. Really got people recognizing that this is a serious issue and that we're going to do this. So I just want to point out that benefit that Rick and Steve and Kelly provided in going through this interview process. So, thank you.
And one question.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier in your presentation about, if FEMA said that a levy was not in compliance, then they weren't going to get certified, period. And it's kind of our feeling that the goalposts have moved a little bit from where they were 5 years ago to where they are now. Did you get any sense of what percentage of levies in the country moved from compliance to non-compliance?
that's actually a great question. I don't know the answer. The answer is no. I don't have a sense. What I do know is that the federal agencies, let me kind of speak on their behalf for a moment. They're caught between, on one hand, not wanting to experience another Katrina and being asked, how come you guys haven't been, more protective? And on the other hand, I'll clean up my language here, ticking off everybody in the country because they're, imposing these new standards and potentially exorbitant costs on folks all over the country. And what I understand is that, first of all, there's an effort, I think it's in Congress, to try to better coordinate the Corps and FEMA on their processes. That isn't quite completed yet. And secondly, they're trying to balance those two things. And it's I think because of that it's difficult to get a very specific answer about what's needed at this time. So I don't envy their position. I think that they're kind of in a tough spot, but they are moving ahead, and I think that there are some issues around this right now in many parts of the country, that this is a sort of a live political issue, going back to what Walter said, in many parts of the country.
On top of that, we have two efforts that are going to help us get more information out of that. Kelly is currently working on environmental scan of the nation and where folks are. And our congressional delegation is going to make a request of the Congressional Research Service to do an investigation of how this is impacting things nationwide, with the intent of bringing this up to a conversation at the congressional level.
I'd like to add a point to that a bit, please.
In Katrina in New Orleans, they had these same conversations, similar conversations to this, prior to Katrina, with folks advocating, saying, political leaders or whatever, saying, well, we don't need to put the money here, we're overprotected, we can divert the funds here, there, or everywhere. And you know, when the levees went down, those guys all disappeared. You know, the politicians who moved the operations and maintenance money somewhere else, or the state guys who moved it somewhere else. And the Corps will not repeat that experience again, because they took that on the chin, caused the chief of engineers to have to resign over that. So I really caution this notion about the political solution, in that I just don't see that as a particularly fruitful approach on this. In the mind of the Corps, what they're doing is based on lessons learned, and I repeat what I said before, this has been going on since the 1920s. They're constantly moving the goalpost, to use that language, going back to the 1920s, and they will likely continue to move the goalpost as they learn new lessons, new events occur, and things like that. So in terms of productive use of time and productive use of resources, getting Oregon Solutions to sit these guys down to the table so the folks with the political authority make those decisions and work out something is probably a good approach, and I think you'll find the Corps receptive to that. If the perception is you're trying to steamroll them, you're going to get a predictable response there that probably is not in your best interest. So just offer that for perspective.
You know, actually, one last point. What we have found with Oregon Solutions in the past is that, in fact, often it's the federal agencies who really like the value of the neutral forum and are willing to then come and participate productively, because oftentimes they're invited by somebody to a meeting who's unhappy with them, and they sort of feel like they're being invited to a public hanging, their own. And so, so they actually, I mean, we have surveys that document this. They really value that neutral forum.
So I want to thank Rick and Steve for the presentations, and Kelly for the work that he put in. And so thank you. We are going to very briefly go through a few issues. I want to show you the website. We're only going to take about 2 minutes to go through it, and Kayla is going to frame some policy issues that we want you to be thinking of as we get together in the fall in our meetings as individual boards. So.
Okay, so I'm going to step over here to this computer and just quickly pull up the new website that we've been working on here. And a couple things I want to note about before we get there is, so this is the current website as it is now, and we know that a priority has not been sort of doing a major revamp of our website, and we didn't do that here. Really, what we did is used a WordPress template, migrated a lot of the content, updated stuff that was out of date, and then added some information on levy accreditation. So we think that the refreshed version was very low cost, and is going to make a huge difference in how we outreach to constituents during this levy accreditation process. So this is our old website, and here is our new website. So we think it looks a lot better. I think you guys will agree. We have some basic information here that was on the old website. It's just in a little more readable form here. Upcoming events. We'll have a subscription to our mailing list so that we can get information out to folks in the community that want more information about the levy accreditation process as it moves along. We've got river level data and other things like that here on the main page. And instead of going, I was going to show you a few more pages, but we'll just make sure you all get this link and you can go through this stuff as well. But one thing I do want to point out is that we have this page here that's called the board member portal. And what we'll use that for is getting materials and information for all the board members in the future. So there's it's password protected, so we'll distribute a password to all of you, and you'll be able to log in there and get agendas, budgets. Well, the budgets will be on the main site as well, but draft materials and other information like that ahead of the meeting, you'll be able to access it from anywhere, so that when your binder's here, you still have access to all the information when you're outside of the building.
Instead of emails, we'll be going to the portal.
Yeah, it'll probably be you'll get an email with a link that'll send you here, so that you'll be able to get to it all the time.
And I'd like to give a lot of credit to Kayla and Angela especially, but all the folks in the office that helped in refreshing this, making it more accurate, making it easy to access information. To give you an idea, we did contract out the actual website development with a ceiling of $2,500. So it's a lot of work for very low cost because of the participation of staff on top of their already existing work.
So we plan on, with unless there's any comments about adjustments, as you guys take a look at the website in the next day or so, we plan on launching it early next week. So the regular MCDD link, the one that's here, we'll direct to our new page starting the beginning of next week. So just since we only have a little bit of time left here, instead of getting into detail about some of the stuff that I was going to talk about, we'll just run through at a high level the issues really quickly, and I'm going to come up to the front now that I don't need to use that. So the first thing that came up in our last format meeting was a discussion about disclosure. The conversation came out of what's the real estate industry's responsibility in disclosing the certification accreditation issue during transactions or during conversations with folks that might be interested in purchasing property. So what we did as a result of that conversation is worked with Vic and Jeff Noodleman, who's not here today, our legal team, and some other folks to develop some language. So I have that language here. And I'm going to pass it around so that you guys can take it back with you. And probably at our board meetings over the next 6 months, we'll want to get some direction from each board about how exactly we want to use that. Whether it's something that we distribute generally to the community at large, whether we want it to be a more focused distribution just to the real estate industry specifically, or things of that nature. So you have the language now. You can use it. Or you can take a look at it, and then we'll be talking about it over the next 6 months or so as you meet in your individual board meetings.
And we may find we need to act faster than 6 months. And so we're going to be responsive based on what your ideas are, and also how are you being asked by people outside our meetings for this information. And we'll share those same conversations we have as staff.
Exactly. So and then 2 minutes that I have left here, I'm just going to highlight some issues that we'll also be bringing up in board meetings over the next 6 months. I won't get into the details of them because we just don't have time right now. And one has to do with encroachments and encroachment permits. So we've talked a lot about how the difference between the Corps' requirements and FEMA's, and a manifestation of that is through the Corps' authorization of encroachments in the levee right-of-way. And without getting into too much detail, and we'll talk about this a lot more at board meetings over the next 6 months, needless to say, the findings in either of those programs sometimes might conflict. And we might be looking over the next few months on policy direction on how to deal with that issue. So there's some information here that I won't get into, but we'll be talking about it soon.
Yeah, give yourself 5 more minutes to go through this and the other ones. You don't have to wrap up in 30 seconds.
Okay, yeah, well, I wish it was simple enough to talk about in 5 minutes, but unfortunately, as is often the case with core programs, it's not exactly straightforward. Wrong direction? And this is just a little bit of context and sort of the direction we're going with the conversation is that when we get core authorization, sometimes those findings may conflict with what we find when we're pursuing accreditation with FEMA. And the more authorizations we have, the more potential conflicts that creates. And so the real question that we're considering is, as we're moving through the accreditation process, whether we continue to seek core authorization for encroachments or whether that raises more potential conflicts that we'd rather deal with on the front instead of after. So that's kind of the question that we'll be wrestling with over the next few months. And then Steve's touched on this briefly, so I won't get too much into it, but we are also starting to think about the who pays scenario. Steve talked about at a high level of when we bring our organizational partners to the table and are talking about the larger scale capital investment costs, how we deal with that. But there's a lot of nuance to it that we're already thinking about, specifically as it relates to utilities, the difference between when an encroachment or an issue is on private or public property, whether that issue was previously authorized by us, but now because of policy changes is no longer acceptable. And how do we deal with those different situations when we're thinking of funding the fixes? So that's another solution that we think or another question that we think will be part of the Oregon Solutions process, but we want the boards to start thinking about on their own as in alignment with Oregon Solutions and the accreditation process.
And just to put this in the context of things that you've discussed in the past, there's been cost sharing that's happened in different districts at different levels. 50% cost share when it's on somebody's private property. Do the boards need to consider that individually, or is that solely left to the Oregon Solutions process to figure out? So we don't want to assume too much about that because you've created policies about that in the past. So something we'll be addressing over the next couple months.
And those are the two big policy considerations that we wanted to talk about. Besides that, your next format meeting is going to be in October. We'll probably be bringing up similar issues around accreditation at that meeting and the next 20, because it's an issue that's going to be with us for a few years. So we look forward to seeing you there. And then lastly, the Columbia Slough Regatta is here at MCDD this Sunday. We'll have hundreds of people on site kayaking in the slough, so everyone's welcome to join if that's of interest. So with that, with just a few minutes over, I'm going to give it back to Reed.
So, want to thank Portland Community Media, who, with 2 days' notice, were able to come out here and videotape this for us. They're a nonprofit organization that promote media and education to the community. Did I say that right? Close enough? Okay. And also the port, who was willing to swoop in if they needed to help out. So I think with that, I'm going to ask the boards to adjourn. So Dick, you want to start?
Hereby adjourn the meeting for Pen 2.
Hereby adjourn the meeting for CDD.
Hereby adjourn the meeting for Sandy Drainage.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
Everyone, please sign in before you leave, including the Portland community of folks.
All right, with that.
What's the time frame for discussion on implementing the Oregon Solutions and how we're going to do it?
So the conversation that we've had so far, and please chime in, Steve, we've talked about having an initial engagement in early fall, September, October timeframe. So what we'll do is email the boards with options and make sure you're comfortable with the timelines moving forward. We're going to have to make that decision the next 2 to 3 weeks, probably once we confirm the conveners. So these are the high-level conveners that the governor asked to be a part of this. It also has to follow with, I think, our request for designation that'll happen in the next 2 weeks. So we'll be in touch with you.
Just a question for clarification. So does that imply that the decision has been made to move forward with Oregon Solutions, or is that a decision that's going to go to each of the boards, or just to Penn 1 and Penn 2 in the case of Steve's work?
So what I did in the Penn 1 and Penn 2 meetings during the budget process is I requested a direction from those boards to go forward with the Oregon Solutions process. So I've been directed by the boards to do that. We can also come up with some direction from MCDD and Sandy about how they want to be participating in the process. And we can do that once we have a better design of what's going forward, and you can be well informed in deciding how you want to be involved. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. All right. We're done. Thank you very much.